Victor Benz with us from Parkland County, and Victor is going to relay his mother's story. Maybe, Victor, you could tell us a little bit about your background, like where you went to school.
Certainly. Well, I was born in Ottawa in 1953. My parents had emigrated to Canada from England in 1950. They were both graduate engineers. One of the things about coming to Canada was that there was work for my father, but my mother was told in no uncertain terms, very few professions are open to women in Canada. And the other big issue at the time was, of course, there were many servicemen returning from the war, and they were expected really to fill the ranks of the employed, not so much immigrants. My father went to work at a pilot plant just in behind the Houses of Parliament, actually, that eventually became a construction project in Fort Saskatchewan for the Sherritt Gordon Mines Limited nickel refinery that was going in there. And we moved as a family in 1954, driving across Canada to Fort Saskatchewan. In Fort Saskatchewan, both my brothers were born, and we, all three of us, went to school in Fort Saskatchewan through the Fort Saskatchewan school system. Eventually, I graduated from high school, went on to university, and graduated with a degree in chemical engineering. From there, I went to work with initially Texaco Canada for a few years, and then an opportunity arose, and I went back to Fort Saskatchewan and joined Sherritt Gordon Mines Limited, and I was employed by them for not quite 30 years. I landed up working all over the world, and I ended my career working in the coal branch for the Coal Valley Mine. I then started my own consulting business for a few years and retired in 2014. And there's the book, for those wondering. It's now been published both in English and in Polish. The book started because my parents, particularly my father, never spoke about the war and his experiences. And he did die very young. I was only 18 when he passed. And my mother, really not all that much. I knew a few family legends, I'll call them, but not much beyond that. I married a French-Canadian lass. And in 1987, her father, there was a family reunion in the St. Paul area, and her father had written a family history in Canada. And depending on whether you use the mother's or father's side, they trace their history back to Nova Scotia, to the mid-1600s. And of course, with that, I started realizing that Mom was one of the last of her generation. And I asked her, start writing. Just, your grandchildren want to know who you were, what happened. What is the family story as you know it? She initially didn't want to write because I'm not a professional writer, I'm not a historian, etc. And I told her that's not the issue here. It's who are the Benzes, where did they come from? What is the family history as you know it, such that your grandchildren can look at it and their children can look at what you've written and know a little bit about themselves. So she started to write in the early 1990s. Her started off as a very small 10, 15 page write, but every time she sent me a draft, it brought more questions, which I would then pose to her, and she would write more. Finally, in the early 2000s, she finished. And she turned to me and said, Vic, you owe me a trip back to Poland. And that's when my relationship with my past really took off with the family's past.
And so, uh, what year was that when you went back?
I first went to Poland in 2003. The book was finished shortly before that. My mother had made me make a promise that the book would not be published until she had passed. She passed in 2013. The English version was printed in 2014, privately published. And once my Polish relatives read the book, they insisted on publishing a Polish version. It was a gradual thing. As I mentioned, my parents never spoke about their experiences. My mother a bit more than my father, but I think some of that had to do with the fact that I was 18 when my father died, which meant that my brothers were 16 and 14. And I'm sure some of the details of what particularly my father experienced, aside from the fact that he would have had difficulty sharing with it, probably wasn't meant for young ears. And as I said, when my stepfather wrote their family story, or not stepfather, father-in-law, wrote their family story, uh, my daughters asked me, so who are the Benzes? We now know who the Belzels are. Who are the Benzes? And I then, actually, for the first time, recognized how little I knew. And I think it's worth mentioning another aspect which affected this, which was that my father, over religious reasons, had a break with his own family. And we grew up being told that we had mother, father, and two brothers. And that was the only family that we had, and that family mattered most. I was completely unaware of just how big my family was back in Poland.
And
I was blissfully ignorant of my past. It also had a little bit to do with the environment in Canada, and particularly in Alberta when we moved here. There was, as now, a very strong pro-Alberta, pro-Canada movement. Although we were in a community with many immigrants, most kept their heritage under wraps, hidden, if you will, from most of the people. I remember my first few years at school, which started in 1959, being regularly beaten up by the local school kids, calling me a DP, a displaced person, and telling me to go back where we came from. And I really didn't understand any of that at the age of 6. But my parents made a conscious decision that they're going to be the best possible Canadians, one, and two, because of the way World War II turned out for Poland, particularly my father, I remember making the statement, Poland is lost to us. There's nothing we can do about it now. We need to focus on the future and what's going to happen to our children. And so we grew up speaking very little Polish at home. We knew some of the basic words, thank you, cheers, and so on and so forth, but not much. And as I got older, particularly in university, I began to encounter Polish first generation fellow students whose parents had approached it a little bit differently. And I began to wish that maybe I'd had that opportunity. Not much, but you've got to recognize the youth is very resilient. And just like our youth today, don't give up what they consider important in life just because something big is happening around them. One of the fascinating aspects of my mother's photo collection was how many of them were of her friends and of outings that occurred during the war.
exactly.
You know, there's a series of photographs of obtaining rowing boats and rowing on the Vistula River out to some of the sandbars and having a party on the sandbar, complete with campfire and wine. And when you look at those photos, today's youth is no different.
Yeah.
My mother did not know that she had an older brother. In December of 43, her fiance at the time was very happy that his best friend was returning from the partisans in eastern Poland. And he introduced his best friend to my mother, and that was, in fact, my aunt's older brother, and Tad became my father eventually. So it was at that point that I realized that trying to understand what happened in World War II had a direct effect on whether my parents would actually ever meet and whether I would be born. So I wanted to be more aware of that. Then the fascinating thing occurred that 10 days after the uprising started, in August 10th, 1944, my parents were married. It was a euphoric moment because at that time everything seemed to be going the way of the Poles in the uprising. And in fact, one of their battalion mates gave them a wedding present of the windshield of a German armored car as one of the wedding gifts. So it was some funny moments. But my father told my mother the reason that they were getting married was he was certain that he would not survive without her. But I did not realize the depth to which their involvement during the war went. At one point, my mother was involved in delivering death sentences that had been handed down by the Polish underground court to those who were due to be executed by the underground army. This is all under the cover of being underground. These people were not in prison. They were roaming the city. And my mother would knock on the door, hand an envelope, and leave. There are parts that my mother told me that didn't make the book, partially because not everyone was honest, true blue, clean living. There were informants and sympathizers to both the German and the Russian forces throughout. That occurs everywhere. So when we get to the discussion of probably the next step is that my mother was wounded shortly after she was married. My father was wounded towards the end of August, and both of them landed up in a hospital which was eventually taken over by the German army, the Wehrmacht, and being cared for there. And a word came down that the German SS was moving into the area, and they had direct orders to kill all underground army participants. What was interesting is the German doctor felt this was wrong and actually organized transport for all the wounded he could transport to the countryside. He basically sent all the women first and their husbands. And since my parents were married, my father joined this convoy out into the country where the drivers promptly ran away, and the local citizenry and the country took care of them really until the end of the war. Prior to the uprising in, I believe, 1942, my father had been arrested by the Gestapo, heavily interrogated, and was sentenced to death, was put on a truck in a small convoy going to the execution site. It happened that that convoy contained a couple of British agents, and the AK had been under instructions to rescue the British agents, and my father happened to be in the truck with the British agents, and he himself was freed. Not taken by the AK rescuers, he had to find his own way. But because of that event, he went to the partisans in eastern Poland, where he remained for a year and a half before returning to Warsaw, preparing for the uprising. So, and my parents ideologically could not submit to the Soviets. They were arrested in Szczecin and put in prison. It turned out that there was a large group of them rounded up, and in that group were a couple of Brits. There was a ransom paid to the Polish communists at that time, and the large group was released, and it included my father, mother, and my father's mother. And they were given 24 hours to leave Poland. If they were still in Poland, they would be rearrested and shot. They made arrangements to escape to West Berlin in secret compartments of trains, etc., etc. Made it to West Berlin, where they were put in touch with the British military authorities, the RAF in this case, because of my grandfather's rank. And then they were smuggled on a road corridor by the RAF to Western Germany, where they awaited the arrival of my grandfather and eventually came to England. A very critical component here is that before the end of the Warsaw Uprising, Churchill negotiated with Hitler that instead of treating the AK members as terrorists, they would be treated as national combatants of an army, an Allied army. That agreement was made, and in the main, the Germans actually kept that agreement. What it meant for my parents was that when they came to the West, they were eligible for service scholarships in England. And that's how they went to university in England. Both my parents, schools were closed with the German arrival. The only schools that were allowed to exist formally were trade schools. Academic schools were outlawed. The teaching of Polish as a language was outlawed. My parents attended the underground school sponsored by the underground state. Both finished their high school, and my father finished first year pre-med. And both my parents switched studies. My mother wanted to teach history, and my father wanted to continue in pre-med, but they had one serious problem. Neither of them spoke English. So in long discussions, they eventually agreed to enter chemical engineering together because math is universal and doesn't need a language. And that's why they actually both graduated with masters in chemical engineering.